So, I'm giving a lecture over Heidegger's Being and Time, specifically the first half, although I think I'll just stress some of the stuff in the second half near the end. I was actually very hesitant about giving this talk just because I feel like I don't come even close to understanding Heidegger yet. But then I decided that I've at least read the book, so I at least know something about Heidegger, and that I feel it's interesting and worth talking about. And so, what I'm going to give you today is definitely not the definitive interpretation of Heidegger. It's not even going to be a complete summary of Heidegger. It's just going to be my attempts to give you a first idea of what he's talking about, and hopefully pique your interest enough to get you to, I don't know, read it yourself or engage in conversation with me or something like that. So don't take anything I say as gospel. It's all been influenced by my own thoughts and my readings of other philosophers and all this stuff. And there's definitely a lot of people in the world who know a lot more about Heidegger than I do, and probably would straight up disagree with some of the things I'm going to say. But nonetheless, I think I've struggled with this for a couple of years, this particular book, and I feel like I've got at least a decent understanding of it. And I feel like there's a lot of important and interesting things in there that we can talk about here today. So feel free to ask questions. Heidegger has a tendency to get really technical. I think I'm going to try to avoid that as much as possible, but if it happens and you're confused, raise your hand and let me know what's going on. So what I'm going to do today is go more or less follow the structure of Division 1 of Being and Time, although not entirely, because he makes weird choices that I don't necessarily agree with in terms of what order things get presented in. I'm definitely going to skip over some things. Basically what we're going to do is we're going to try to set up a new system for viewing the world. What Heidegger does is very different from a lot of other philosophers do. He's not so much starting with the same premises and showing that he can get to different conclusions, or even necessarily arguing for his premises. What he's really doing is I'll tell you specifically what his method is in a bit when we get there, but what he's doing is more so setting up a new way of looking at the world that he claims is just better, that just captures more of what is actually going on. And the way we evaluate the system is by doing it, is by applying it to the world, seeing if it fits what's going on better. So what I'm mostly going to be doing is essentially just laying out a system, defining some words, talking about how they interact, and seeing if these new categories that Heidegger creates can be useful for talking about the world. And hopefully at the end, if I have time, I'll take a couple example cases of relatively real-world claims that we can see if we can understand them better using Heidegger. So I'm just going to start at the beginning. So what is this book about? Well, it's about being. Specifically, what do we mean when we say being? The introduction, he talks about how there's a long tradition of talking about being. There's this whole genre of philosophy called ontology. And so we talk about what properties beings have and like all these things. But we've forgotten how to ask the question, what does it mean to exist? What do we even mean by the word to exist? So he thinks we need to go back, figure out how to ask the question, and then ask it, which are things that modern philosophy can't do. It doesn't even know how to ask the question anymore, according to Heidegger. And so, just to give you a taste of the way he does everything, he says, well, first we need to examine what a question is in order to examine what the question of being is. And so he says that questions have three components. What is being asked about, which is being. What is to be found out by the asking, which is the meaning of being, specifically. And the third thing is what is to be interrogated, who we're going to ask about this. And he thinks, well, things that exist is what we're going to ask. So this is the basic structure of his project. Because Heidegger likes to be formal, and it seems like what he wanted to do, he specifically is going to set out that we're going to ask about being in order to find out the meaning of being. And we're going to do this by interrogating the entities themselves, the objects. And specifically, we need to pick, an entity to start analyzing. But the whole sphere of asking questions and talking about being is something that belongs to a very specific sort of being, namely us. So he's going to start by examining us and what kind of being we have. And from there, hopefully this will allow us to get to the structure of being in general. So this is his theoretical purpose. He thinks this will let us build a foundation for everything else. If we know what existence means, then we can talk about all sorts of other things. When we can get like a science of like anthropology or psychology if we understand our own existence. it's not actually necessarily all that important. This is like his goal, but what's really interesting about Heidegger is where he goes from it and the system he sets up. So that's theoretically what we're going to be doing. So specifically, our method's going to be phenomenological. That means we're going to attempt to not have any preconceptions. We're going to attempt to understand the world simply as it presents itself to us. This is taken a lot from Husserl, who was Heidegger's teacher. Just the idea of like stepping back and letting the world present itself to us. So let's start by looking at us. So we're the entity that's going to be interrogated. We're going to be what we're going to study. He defines us as being Dasein, which for some reason is never translated in English versions of Heidegger. It just means being there. Da means there, Sein means being. So this word Dasein is his equivalent of like man or a sentient being or something like that in other philosophers. This is what we are. But he makes up his own word as he does all the time because he thinks that there are too many preconceptions with all the other words that are being used. So what is a Dasein? What are we? Well, his initial definition is that Dasein's essence is in its being. Specifically, it is the being whose being is an issue to it. What does that mean? That means that in being a Dasein, existence is something that a Dasein does. It's not something that just like happens to a Dasein. Dasein is about being in a world and manipulating things and causing. Well, I feel like I need a little bit more foundation to put this in Heidegger terms. You'll understand this better as we go along. But basically, it's the being who is existential, the being who has the ability to have goals. It's the teleological being. And you'll find out a lot more about that as I go on. One of the things that we learned about a Dasein, first of all, is that it's always in a world. That you never see a Dasein that is just literally a brain in a vat floating out in space. A Dasein is in a world, and he means this in a very specific sense. By world, he doesn't mean the collection of objects in the universe. He doesn't mean, and he uses the term universe to distinguish from world. What a world is well, he calls it an equipmental totality. It's the entities that, or not even entities, it is the structure that Dasein interacts with in such a way so that it has the type of being of equipment. So let's take a hammer. Let's take a specific example. Heidegger doesn't like specific examples. He does it occasionally, but not nearly often enough, and that's part of why he's so difficult. But he talks about hammers a lot, so I'll talk about a hammer too. Heidegger likes hammers. When we're talking about a hammer, what it is, first and foremost, is a piece of equipment. It is, essentially, he defines equipment as something in order to something else. A hammer is only genuinely a hammer in the act of hammering. It is something that when we approach it as something with which we can obtain a goal. It's something that has what he calls an assignment. It has a relation with other things in a specific goal-oriented way. So he says that the hammering does not simply have knowledge about the hammer's character of equipment, but it has appropriated this equipment in a way which cannot possibly be more suitable. So in dealing with a hammer, the most fundamental thing to do with it is to pick it up and start hitting shit with it. This is what you do with a hammer. This is what a hammer is. To define a hammer as anything else misses the point.